what we're going to talk about in the session. So I'm going to talk a little bit about code or not, talk about how you can analyze your content, what the different, some sample scenarios. I've got some guidelines for writing for reuse and also governance, and that's controlling your reuse. So when we talk about DITA all the time, there's a lot of talk about the code. And everybody wants to see the code when they're seeing, okay, so Scott's saying we don't see my slides. All right, give me 1 second here, and let's try this again. So are you seeing them now? Yay, Scott says yes. Okay, good. Great. Apologies for that. Technology, isn't it wonderful? So, as I say, in terms of talking about the code, and certainly when we think about DITA and how it's evolved, it has been quite technical in its presentation to people. And if you've ever tried to read the spec, it's incredibly difficult to understand, but that's a spec for developers, vendors, people who are going to be putting DITA into their systems. And it's not something that the average writer needs to deal with. So there's a lot of good tools out there these days where you can work in an environment that's very word-like, and you don't have to deal with all the codes. And the way I present my examples are without showing all the codes. So I just wanted to point that out, that it's not about the code, it's about the strategy and figuring out what you're going to do, and then how are you going to support that. So what is a content strategy for reuse? Well, essentially, it's a summary of your reuse situation and your opportunities, and I'll tell you how you're going to do that. Then once you've figured that out, you need to make decisions on how you're going to support the reuse. So you begin with what do you need to do, and then you figure out how to support it, and then you figure out how to manage it, and that's reuse governance. So what are the benefits? Well, major benefit is with planned reuse. I do a lot of work with a lot of different companies, often helping them to move towards content management and reuse in the beginning. But I also work with companies who've chosen to move forward and move towards content management on their own. But we often get a phone call from companies that have decided to go ahead, and they wanted to do reuse in the beginning, and that was a major reason they wanted to get the content management system. But they were finding that there wasn't a lot of reuse happening. And if reuse was happening, it's not being done consistently. And so they want help in terms of developing a reuse strategy. So it's really planned reuse. You know what you're going to reuse, how you're going to reuse it. It's going to be designed for reuse. So it's not just going to be taking a topic here and a topic there and saying, okay, well, it doesn't quite fit, but I'm going to use it anyway. It's saying, no, this is how we write things. So it's well designed for that. When you do that and you have an actual plan and all your writers have been trained and your stakeholders all understand the value of reuse and they don't keep trying to rewrite things every time they see it, all those sorts of things, you get a greater percentage of reuse. It's part of your methodology. It's part of your workflow. And then it's also because you've got a plan of action on how you're going to address things, it allows you to say, well, no, this person is not allowed to change the content. Only this person has the authority to do so, because you don't want content just changed willy-nilly throughout your information set. So there's a lot of benefits to controlling it with a content strategy for reuse. So how do you go about analyzing your content? I know a significant portion of you are probably doing online content only, be it help or web or wikis or all sorts of different things. But when we do analysis of content, we work with print. That doesn't mean you have to have print documents. It means that we're going to print out pages. We're going to print out screens. We're going to print out a variety of different things, because it's really hard to compare content unless you've got a whole wall of monitors and you can look at something on one and something on another and something somewhere else. So we work with printed materials and we mark them up. We use colored highlighters to identify content that's identical. similar, and unique. And so we're always working with comparative, that this information is like this one. When we do that, we get an understanding of what's being reused or should be reused, more is the case, it's not always being reused, how big those chunks should be, and at what level that reuse is happening. So is it happening at the topic level, or is it a little piece of content in the topic that's changing? Everything else is the same. Where is that all happening? So we can start to look at that, and we start to make decisions. Well, it should be identical across the board. This minor change should not occur, or yes, this minor change should occur. How are we going to handle that? So we create a list of all the different types of content that can be reused. You may also want to do a programmatic analysis of your content, which is you can run your content through products, such as what DCL offers, and they will match it up, and they'll run and give you pie charts and reports and all sorts of things to show you where you've got identical content, where you've got similar content, and this gives you, you know you've looked at everything, because it's impossible for us to manually look at every piece of content. However, it's extremely important to start off and do it manually because you learn so much by doing that. Excuse me. So I use an example both in the DITA 101 book and here on it's a recipe. And I use recipes because recipes are structured. And I know many of you will say, well, you know, I want something like what I work on. But you could be in telecommunications. You could be in nuclear reactors. You could be doing medical devices. You could be doing all sorts of things. Everybody knows what a recipe is. Not everybody knows the kind of content that you work with. So I use it. It's very simple to start with. And I am showing some of the tags here. This is a recipe. And before anybody mentions it, yes, there's a U in flavor. And that's because this is a recipe for Canada. And Canadians use metric, which you see on the left, and imperial, which you see on the right. They're a combination of both because they're transitioning to metric system. So I think I actually got that mixed. It should be imperial on the left and metric on the right. Anyway, so it has a structure to it. It's got steps. It's got ingredients. We've used a short description. So we've got this piece of content, and we're going to look at different pieces of it and talk about the different types of reuse that we have. And one of the biggest pieces of reuse that we have is what we call section-based reuse. So you're reusing an entire section or grouping of information. So I know a lot of you in the hardware area, and so a lot of the, maybe the introductory safety or regulatory information that you have at the beginning of your documents, that's a perfect opportunity for section-based reuse. It's usually common across a lot of your pieces of information. And the way we reuse that huge chunk of information is we create a map. A map is like a table of contents, and it groups the topics together in one spot. So we can just say reuse the whole map instead of having to go get this topic and that topic and another topic and et cetera, and maybe missing a topic. It's all together, grab it, and you can reuse it. And you can reuse it into another map. So maybe you've got a service guide. You just drop it into the beginning of your service guide, and you've got all that information. Now the content in that map could be identical throughout. So all the topics, all the information, everything's exactly the same. But there is a possibility that in some of those topics that are within it, there is some variations. And I'm going to talk about what some of those variations could be. So we've got a section, which I said we could use in a map. Now the most common way that we reuse content is at the topic base. And in fact, DITA was designed around topics so that you would have the greatest ability to move content around and reuse it in a lot of different places. So topics can be reused. You just pull them into the map, and there they are. And they can exist in multiple maps, or you can reference them in. So you could be in the topic and reference another topic into it. I usually don't recommend that. I prefer it at the map level, but there are some times where you might want to do that. And again, top could be reused identically, or there may be a substructure of reuse. So here's just a simple example. So, you know, I'm creating a recipe book, and I've got a variety of different recipes. And I could have Italian recipes, and I could put something like anise almond biscotti underneath the cookies. But I could also group it, say, by country. And so my anise almond biscotti can appear under Italy. So someone could look up recipes for Italy under the world of dessert. I can do so many things with how I organize my information. Then we have content references. This is called conref in DITA. And this is where you can use a piece of a topic. So you don't have to reuse the whole topic. You could say, for example, I've got I've got cautions, and I want to make sure that they're used consistently throughout my information set. So I'm going to reuse that caution. I'm going to write it once. It's going to be accessible to all sorts of different writers, but I'm going to reuse it into my content. So I go out, and I can point to that caution and reuse it into my materials. Now, there's a couple ways you can do that. You could go and say, okay, where was that caution written? Maybe it appeared first in your safety information, so you might go there and go and pull it in. Now, that's certainly one way of doing it, but that means that you have to know where that content appears in order to be able to go and find it and reuse it. And even if you know where it is, the next writer may not know where that is. So if you've got self-contained bits of information like a caution, then you might want to group all your cautions together in a fairly large topic, what we call a warehouse topic, and I've gotten that term from Mark Lewis. He coined that term first, so that they're all there and everybody knows you can go and find it and reuse it. But you can reuse other information. You can reuse a step. We sometimes have companies who say the last step in software is always, click save to blah, blah, blah. And just to make sure that all the capitalization and everything else is correct in it, they reuse that one step. You can pretty much reuse anything this way using conref. You can use images. You can use tables. You can use a variety of different things. But think about how you're going to do it, and that's part of your content strategy. So here's an example, going back to the Mediterranean couscous. So what I've done is I've created a list of definitions for different types of pasta. Very few people know that couscous is actually a pasta. They often think it's a grain. So I've got a definition for couscous, that it's a tiny pasta that originated in North Africa. And you can see in the body of the content, it's highlighted and it's circled down below, that I am referencing it in from my pasta topic into my content. As I said, could be anything you want to bring in. And could be a series of pieces of information as well. So that was a conref. Now, the next thing that we often look at is conditional reuse. And conditional reuse is probably the most common type of reuse that you will do after topic-based reuse. So you're using a big topic, or in this case, you're using a topic, but you have a core set of information in it, and then you may have some variations in that content. For paragraphs, maybe a paragraph is different, an image may be different. The conditions could be for audience, or for product, or for region, or for a variety of different things. But what you do is you're keeping it all together, and it's really nice to be able to do that. And instead of creating multiple topics, referencing in the content that is the same, and then just having your one piece that's different, because then you're having to manage all these different topics. This way, everything's in one spot. Somebody's editing it, somebody's reviewing it. It's all in one spot. So when you are using a condition, you apply. Many of you have probably used FrameMaker in the past, and you know how you add a condition that way. Pretty similar in using the XML tools today. You highlight the content that you want to apply the condition to, but then you add what's called an attribute. An attribute is just another term for metadata or a way of tagging your content. So I gave an example here. You might have audience. So you go under your audience and you click on it and it drops down and you say, oh, I want sysadmin. So you pick the sysadmin, and then that will only appear when you publish your content for system administrators. All the rest of it is filtered out. That is not applicable. So you've got core, everybody sees, then you have the variations that only some groups see. So again, here's an example. And you can see that I have once again circled the content that I referenced in, and I've highlighted it this time. And you can see up on the right, I've got my attribute inspector up, and you can see that the audience is novice. And so what I've done here is said, well, you know, maybe if this is a cookbook for chefs, we probably don't have to tell them that couscous is a pasta. But for a novice audience, maybe, you know, kids going off to college and making their first meals, whatever, you would include more information for these people. Then we have variable reuse. A lot of times we have content which is pretty much identical except for a word or maybe a phrase in that content. And that's often for things like a product name. So you've got this piece of information, it's identical, but the product name changes depending upon which product you're using the information in. So then what we want to do is create a variable called product name, and then we can substitute what the value is. Now in DITA 1.1, which many of you, if you're already using DITA, are still in, and that's okay because DITA 1.2 has only just been released, you would create a variable using a conref. So you might have the value of that information somewhere else, and you would reference it in, like I talked about content references. That was okay, but it really wasn't as useful as it could be. In DITA 1.2, we have something that are called keys, and I'm going to show you some information about keys. So here's an example first where we're showing you, you can see down the left in the first column of the table, you can see some highlighting. Cups, teaspoon, lots of cups, tablespoons, that sort of thing. In that case, what we've done is referenced in the content. And the reason we did that for this fictitious scenario is that all sorts of people are contributing recipes, and they've got cups capital letter, they've got lowercase cups, they've got teaspoon with a capital T, lowercase t, and certainly we could have had a set of writing guidelines that would ensure that people wrote it correctly. But just for the sake of giving you an example, we've shown you how you could actually say, well, you know, we're always going to use cup in a certain way. So that's where you reference it in that example. So let's talk a little bit more about keys. Keys on the first level sound pretty complicated, but they're actually not. Keys are like pointers or an alias to something else. So you can use keys to define the value, or you can also use keys to reference in an image or a topic. So what do you have to do first? Well, first you have to say, okay, I'm going to create something, say something like product name. So I'm going to define a value called product name. And then I'm going to say product name in this particular book that I'm working in. And by the way, these are all defined in your map. So they're not within the topic itself, they're within the map. So whatever's there applies to everything within your content. You could do it at a lower level as well, but if you do it at the top level, it overrides everything on the way down. So we typically look at it from the top level, the map level, and it says, well, whenever you encounter product name in the content, put in, you know, Acme ABC, you know, whatever the product name happens to be. So in your content itself, you put in a key ref where you're pointing to the value of the key. And so it automatically gets replaced. So, you know how in the beginning I said I wasn't going to show you any code? Well, I apologize. I'm showing you some code. And the reason I'm doing that is because 1.2 has just been released, and the tools that I love to use for authoring are not all up to date with 1.2, so I can't show you a nice, friendly exposure to it. I am going to show you the code, but I've just used fragments here to try and make it really, really simple. So I've got a map for recipes. I've then defined a variable called cup. And in this particular document, the recipes, whenever you see the keyword cups, whenever you see cup in your topic, then it gets replaced with cups. Same with tablespoon. And instead of the whole word tablespoon, it gets replaced with TBSP. So when I'm actually in my content, so remember we were looking at a recipe and it had the columns for the ingredients, it would normally say 1 3/4 cup. But I'm going to say I'm going to reference the variable. So here's my key ref, and it's cup, and it replaces it with cups. I'm going to reference somewhere else tablespoon, and it's going to replace it with the shorter version, the acronym TBSP. So it's really quite simple to use keys, and believe me, after looking back at some of the projects we've done over the last few years, if I'd had keys a while ago, it would have made my life so much easier. And I do have one example I'm going to talk about here. So here's my scenarios and solutions. So to just give you a kind of understanding of what we've done and what we kind of see for the most case. So we have the typical scenario we see most often. And it's a hardware company, and they have a number of products. And we look at the content, and at first we thought, well, maybe we can reuse content between our products. Well, in fact, in this situation, this particular example, there wasn't a lot of opportunity for reuse between the products, but there was a lot of information that could be reused across their help and their e-learning and their demos and their videos. And this is going broader, so I'm working with technical communications materials. We were working with their training group, and the training group also created little tiny demos for how to do different things so you could actually see what was going on. So when we looked at the tasks, we looked at them in the help files, and then we looked at them in the e-learning materials. They were similar, but they were definitely not identical. You had two different writers, an instructional designer and a technical writer, and they written them differently. So one might have 5 steps, one might have 4. They were, essentially talking about the same thing, but they were not the same. So it was a wonderful opportunity for reuse. And then when we looked at the videos and we looked at the scripts, because when we're talking about reuse here, yes, you can reuse pieces of videos, and people are doing that. But for our example today, we looked at the script itself, the piece of information that was narrated to talk about what they were doing. And again, they were going through a series of tasks, but the script was similar, but not identical to the help. In fact, it was similar and not identical to the e-learning as well. So that was the 3rd time that same piece of content had been written. We saw that over and over and over again. So here's some of the solutions. When we were looking at the information for the e-learning materials, what we decided was that the help materials, the way it was written in help, would be the primary use for the task. So we're going to try to identically reuse all our tasks into the training materials. And but the tasks were, the training materials were a little bit different because they were preceded by a concept, so giving your learners, some background. And then the task was followed by another task, which might be exercises, something like that, or maybe a lesson assessment, questions and answers. So that was the first thing we did. We said identical task, and we're just going to augment with extra pieces for the e-learning. Then we decided, okay, how are we going to do this for the video? So we took a look at the content for the video and tried to figure out what was really different there. And there was a lot of sort of setting the scene type information, and there was a lot of result type information, which we didn't have in the help materials. So the information in the right-hand model shows green for context and green for result. And those, the black structure there was the same, whether you were in the learning materials, whether you were in the help materials, or whether you were in the video materials for the script. That was all exactly the same. So all the steps were the same, everything. But the results were specific to the video, and the context was specific to the video. And we had to go one more layer in terms of putting together our reuse strategy. We really had to look at the writing, because the technical writers wrote tasks a bit more formally. You know, they didn't use a lot of you and we and those sorts of things. And the instructional designers did use a lot of that. So we had to come together. We had to kind of compromise, because we didn't want the tasks when they were in the help to sound too cutesy. Well, in the same instance, we didn't want them to sound too formal when they were in the learning material. So we kind of met in the middle, and everyone then knew how to write their steps, how to write the information that was associated with it. So our reuse strategy involved reusing the content in multiple ways and changing the way we wrote. Here's a moderate complexity reuse example, which is, again, another hardware company. I was pleased when I saw how many of you were in hardware, because that's where a lot of these examples came from. And they had families of products. So with the families of products, there was a tremendous opportunity to reuse content between members of the same product line. So they had installation guides, they had service guides, and when we looked at the information, about 60% of the topics were almost identical within a family. Obviously not across families, but within a family. But there were differences for product names. In some cases, there were different sections, so they'd have different error codes for things. Occasionally, there would be different or additional steps in a task, and images were definitely different. So what did we do? Well, we created what we called a master map for each type of information. So if you've got an installation guide, these are all the pieces that go in the installation guide. If you've got a service guide, here's all the pieces that go in the service guide. And we would pull in all the common content so that you'd have that to start with. And what they decided they wanted to do, you could manage everything in the same map, but they were afraid of getting a little bit confused, so they decided they're going to duplicate the map. It doesn't duplicate the topics. It's just, okay, I'm going to make another version of this reusing all the same topics. And then that would be specific to a particular product. So they added in their unique topics. We put in variables for things like product names, and then we conditionalized their images. And in this case, there were up to 9 different images in some of the product families. So a little bit confusing, but not once the writers got started with it. It was obvious to them which image belonged to which, because of they knew their products really well. So here's another one. This is a complex one. This one, we spent a very, very, very long time. In fact, we tackled it twice. Once at the beginning of the project as they were just moving to DITA, and then again after they'd moved to DITA and had their content management system in place. So we decided not to actually do reuse in the beginning, because this was a group who was very, very, very new to all the concepts, and we thought that it might be too much in the beginning based on the complexity of the reuse. So reuse, as I said, was really complicated. Many topics were structurally the same, but the content was entirely different. So think of something like a specification. So you've got temperature, size, heat, whatever. You've got all sorts of different things. Well, the structure was identical, but the content was not. It was very different products. They had it for 4 different regions. Within every product family, and there could be up to 12 different images based on the product. There could be each of those images there could be a multiple of up to 12 for things like metric and imperial measures. They used a ton of illustrations in this particular project. In fact, every single step in every single task had a picture of what you saw on the screen. So every screen had to change a metric imperial. And then they had 24-hour time. So Europeans would use 24-hour time and 12-hour for North America. So there was a lot that was varying, and yet a significant portion of the text was identical. Only the images would change. So we could have had one product, piece of information, and just set up for which of the images. But we wanted to try and keep the text together so that If it changed everywhere. And when you're in a regulated environment like this company was, they had to make sure they caught absolutely every instance and change it. So they could have con-refed, so referenced in the text, and then put in the images, so then anytime the text changes, it would be fine. But it was too complicated because we were breaking for every single step. It was just not happening. We could not reflect all the products in one topic. As you can see there, the numbers would be very high. So we compromised a little bit. We created a master topic. We duplicated the master for each product. Then we conditionalized the images for all the variants, so things like the measurement and the time. And then we set up the CMS to trigger a notification if the master topic changed. Not perfect. It meant that the writers, if they'd had a duplicate copy of that topic and there was a change, they had to make sure they went in and changed it. But it wasn't as bad as it was before, where they were constantly reinventing the wheel. And they're in a situation right now where they're looking at using DITA 1.2 and the use of keys. A book, a map for each of the products, define all of the images, point to them, and just have it referenced in. So you could have exactly the same content, but it would reference in a different set of images each time based on the map. That would be cool. The other thing that we did was we created shell topics for the structurally similar things. So as I was saying, like specifications, error codes, things like that. So they duplicated the shell, so they got all the pieces in there, and then they filled in the content. They tended to be very tabular, the ones that we used as shells. And in the future, they're looking to make them as templates. So this is where I wanted to ask the poll. So I'm not sure, Scott, can we relaunch our poll here by any chance?
No, but I can ask you, I can tell you the answers to the questions.
That would be good.
All right. We were asking what type of reuse the audience said they had. Is that the question you were on?
That's right.
26% said typical across products or media. 17% said they have a reuse level that's moderate across various products and media, but they may need to reference content to other places. Some have, let's see, some 24%, so wow, a quarter of the audience has complex reuse needs. And then 33%, so about a third of the audience, doesn't really know yet what their complexity level will be.
And that's okay, and that's why they're on the webinar. So that's really good. And for those with the complex reuse, a content reuse strategy is so important. Okay, well that was great information. So I want to move on. So those are the different types. That's how we kind of think about it. That's how we make some of our decisions. But it's not just about how you reuse the content. It's also about how you write the content. Because if the content isn't written for reuse, it's very jarring and we have to change it. We don't want to do that. So you have to write structured content. And everybody says, well, I'm using DITA. Aren't I writing structured content? You might be, but even though you're writing to a structure, a title can be anything you want it to be. So we set up things like, what is your structure for a title for concept? Is it always a gerund, you know? So, sorry, not a gerund. Is it, do you always say about or this, that, and the other thing in it? Does a task have a gerund? So installing this, doing that. Is it clear what a reference topic is? That way, all of your titles are very consistent. Not only is it easier for you to reuse it, it's a whole lot easier for your audience to look at something and go, bang, that's exactly what I want. I don't know how many times I see things that I think are a task, and they're really a concept because of the way the titles have been phrased. So that's one thing. Maybe you have to go in and figure out, well, what kinds of tasks are you going to create? Are you going to create very specifically ordered steps? And this is getting into a level of DITA I can't get into in great detail now, but like there's a command, and then there's a step result, and there's info, and there's examples, and all sorts of things that you can use in there. So what do you do? Do you ever use steps which are not ordered? And if so, how does somebody write that? What about if you have content which is largely embedded in a paragraph and it isn't broken out into things like results? Are you going to let people do that, or are you going to make them break it out into results? Do you use short description? Some companies never use it. Others do. Some use it as text. Some use it for search and retrieval. Are you going to use results? When do you use a concept versus reference? This has got to be one of the biggest areas I see that writers always get confused. How do I know it's a concept versus a reference? What's the difference? Make sure that's very clear to your writers when they use which. What's their style for writing? How do you write text that will be conditionalized so that if you turn off or you're hiding some of that content when it's going into publication, how does it read, or does it get really choppy because it's missing part of the text which is no longer visible? How do you write content that's going to be conreft? I know a lot of people will say, well, we don't know it's going to be conreft. Well, then you don't have a content reuse strategy. You need to know it's going to be conreft, and there's certain things maybe you shouldn't. And then finally what we need to do is we need to figure out how are we going to govern our reuse. Too many times organizations go in, they set up reuse, they get fantastic results from reuse, but then it all starts to fall apart, usually about the 18-month, 2-year mark, because they're not controlling their reuse. And anybody can take a topic maybe and change it. Maybe somebody can take a topic and instead of reusing it identically, they create a different version of it. We call it derivative. And then somebody goes in and they reuse the derivative and not the original one. So you've got to figure out who owns reusable topics. Even if you don't have ownership on the rest of your content, you must have ownership on reusable topics because not everybody should be allowed to change them. Do you know when you've changed a topic and you want to, we call it promoting it to reuse. So I change a topic. Does that mean that automatically everybody can go ahead and use it, or should it be reviewed and said, okay, now we can put this in the pot that everyone's allowed to reuse? What about variables? The way it's set up right now in DITA, pretty much anybody could set a variable. You can set them up for your own maps. You can set them. You can do all sorts of things, but maybe you shouldn't. So thinking about how you're going to control it. It's not to be overly restrictive, but you've got structured content now. Hopefully you've got a content management system. You've probably got workflow. You should be managing your reuse at the same time. And we've had companies, like we had a medical device company a couple of years back who justified their content management system on risk management. So they were saying, if we control everything, we will have less risk. And they had somebody who went in and wanted to change some of the content that had been approved by the regulatory agency, and the system said, you're not allowed. And they'd had a similar situation to that just a couple of years previous, and they spent $2 or $3 million settling that particular case. So if you control it, you can save a lot in what you're doing. So in summary, you've got to analyze your content to figure out what your opportunities for reuse are. And you're looking at what is, and you're determining what should be, so the to be. You design, you figure out how you're going to do it. You determine how you're going to support it with DITA. And then you're going to formalize, and this is really important. You formalize all your decisions in a content strategy for reuse. This is like a spec. This is something that management signs off on. This is something that you can use in training so everybody knows how they should be reusing content. And then, of course, you manage your reuse, so you have your governance based on your content strategy. So there's a lot of information there. We'll open it up to questions. And just to point out again, here is a couple of books that we've written. Managing Enterprise Content, DITA 101, the conference that we're having in a very short time now, 3 weeks, in Palm Springs. And if you're interested in attending that conference, the early bird and the January special registration has expired, but if you quote the name of this webinar, we will still give you the early bird rate. So you can still come in at that rate, and then just some ways to contact me. So got about 10 minutes left here, so Scott, I'm sure there's lots of questions.
There are, and just so everybody knows, if you check your chat window, there are links and descriptions to all the things that Anne was telling you about, the various books, the conference, and her website, so that you can reference them there. They're just a click away. We'll start with a few questions from the audience. Anna Parker Richards asks, has anyone developed a cheat sheet of all the elements from a high level with a description that we can use? Kind of like a mall map. We can delve into data and content management just by looking at this resource.
There are some cheat sheets, certainly in the DITA 101 book. And by the way, hello, Ann. Anna Parker and I have worked together for a number of years. So within the DITA 101 book, we have put together some top-level descriptions in our quick reference section. There still is not a lot out there on really getting this sort of top-level understanding of DITA, and I know that the industry would be well served if somebody was putting this together and wanted to share it with everyone else. So just a very quick top-level quick reference cheat sheet, as you call it, that would be great.
All right, excellent. Another question has come in, and this one is from Anna H. She'd like to know how the strategy that you've described today, the unified content strategy, fits into a content strategy for the web, something like proposed by Christina Halverson. She wants to know, is it relatable? Does it also use analysis and content inventory, etc.? I could touch on this for just a second by saying that Christina Halverson has told me personally that Anne is the queen and mother of content reuse and content strategy, and that both she and I are participating in Christina's conference later this year during the summer in Minneapolis on content strategy, and that they do indeed share some kinds of things, and that Christina is definitely focused on the web. Anne, what do you have to say about that?
Well, content strategy is a content strategy is a content strategy. You follow the same methodology, but it may be for different types of content. So in this case, we were talking about reuse. It could be for broader-based web materials. It could be for social media. The methodology, the principles of content strategy are the same. And I like to think that I coined the term content strategy and with the book, Managing Enterprise Content, a Unified Content Strategy, because it wasn't really talked about then, and it's only been in the last few years that they've been starting to use it in the web. So it's the methodology is the same, it's only the content that changes.
Right, exactly. In fact, I think the level of detail, too. Christina's firm focuses on some different types of solutions, but I'm sure there's some overlap every once in a while as we start to port our content that used to exist in manuals and online help systems onto the web. I'm sure there's some overlap. We've got another question, which is there's a specialization that's just been released for DITA for publishers, which I published a link to here a little while ago. It's for book publishers. What are the opportunities for reuse in this arena?
Well, it's really fun looking at what's happening in publishing right now. You probably all heard about the EBook Revolution, and if you haven't got an iPad or an iPhone or a Kobo or a Kindle or a whatever, you're probably going to get one real soon now. And there are so many similarities to what's happening in the publishing world as to what happened in the technical publications world when you went from help to print. And what they've done is they've taken DITA because we, as I said up front, it can be a little complicated. And they don't use reuse quite to the level that a technical communicator would. But what they've done is they've created some specialization so you can have things like a sidebar that you might get in text. Or, we've got task, concept, and reference. They've got sidebars. They've got summaries. They've got introduction. They've got a variety of different pieces that are relevant to publishing. Topic types, I should say.
Got it. So we're going to see a lot of crossover there.
Yes.
I've got another question that says, for all of our legacy content, the materials that's already been written, how do we go about identifying sections for reuse? Boy, it sounds like a lot of work.
Yes, for all your legacy content, it can be a lot of work if you've got a lot of information. And that's where I think a programmatic analysis comes in. I think it's extremely important you sit down in the beginning to get a sense of how where those opportunities are yourself, because once you do that, your mind is working on, oh, well, we could do this, we could do that, oh, I see what's being done. But when you've got a lot of legacy content, it's much better to hand it off to a computer and have it analyze the content and figure out where the opportunities are. It's a lot like translation memory, where they match things.
Right, and I think Data Conversion Laboratory, our sponsor today, has a tool that also can be used to help analyze collections of documents, and this is an automatic kind of content reuse finding tool that's great for searching through huge collections of data, which DCL specializes in, and their tools are very good at helping. And are those the kind of tools that you use when you're trying to take like your human experiences and lessons learned and match them up with what a computer can tell you about the content? In other words, looking at the content is one thing, but programmatically going through it and analyzing it seems like that's a really valuable shortcut.
It's a valuable, absolutely. It's valuable. I'm not sure if I'd use the word shortcut. It's an extremely valuable add-on to. Okay. I always believe in doing it the human way first, and it doesn't mean you have to do all your content. It might be just a day's worth of sitting down with your content. But then you do the programmatic, and the reason you do that is because then when you start to see the results of the analysis, then you're able to interpret it because you have seen these and similar situations in the content that you've worked with.
Yeah, that's obvious now that I see it. Okay, yeah, right. So you're just reinforcing that and probably looking for patterns you can't see easily as with human eyes.
Yes, yes, and the sheer quantity, because sometimes we just can't go through it all. There's no way.
What percentage of reuse might there be in a typical information set?
We find a minimum of 25%. Everywhere in any types of content. However, depending upon the organization, so say the example, the middle one, the moderate one that I gave there, with their hardware materials, we actually saw up to 80%. With the last example, the complex one, we were amongst a product family, we were seeing 60%. So they can go much higher. When you start to bring in all sorts of different types of information, it tends to water it down, but within a related set of content, it can go quite high depending upon what you're doing.
Excellent. And what are the learning what kind of learning have you had and from working with the OASIS Enterprise Business Docs team, the people who are looking for other ways to apply DITA?
Well, when DITA started out as a tech docs, really, standard for help and things like that. But in looking at it from the business perspective, we have found that really DITA can apply in a much, much broader way, and reuse can apply. So we've done things like looked at proposals. So anyone who's ever had to write a proposal, you say the same things over and over again. Well, reuse is wonderful there. Also RFPs when you're sending it out to companies. Marketing materials, the way you say certain things about your product, you can reuse content there. With job descriptions, policies and procedures. There are a lot of different places where reuse and structure would apply. And so just like there was DITA for publishers where it was specific to their nomenclature that they're using for their content, we're just looking to see, are we using the exact same topics, or are there some that are slightly different that make more sense in an enterprise situation? But believe me, the opportunities are identical.
Great. And I'm going to try to get two questions in really quick because I think you can answer them briefly before we run out of time. Who do you see, I guess this would be the kind of role in an enterprise who manages the content strategy? Who's in charge of that? Who takes over?
I always recommend that organizations put in place an information architect. I know when people think about information architecture, they think about the web, but you are architecting your content. When you move to structure, when you move to reuse, when you've got metadata, when you've got workflow, you are architecting your content, and you need someone who's very good at design and analysis to manage that.
And the last question is, how do there are things that people should keep in mind when internationalizing DITA content that will be reused. Could you give us a few tips?
I missed that. There was a high-pitched squeal. Could you say
Oh,
that
I'm
again?
sorry. There are things that people should keep in mind when internationalizing DITA content that will be reused. I'm imagining some multiple language issues here. Could you discuss some of the issues when internationalizing DITA content?
Okay, I think the webinar is trying to tell us we should finish up now, but the big thing is conrefs. Conrefs don't always work well because you don't always have the content to reference when you send it out to the translation vendors.
Okay, great. We're going to follow up with, of course, some written answers to all the questions, including the ones that we didn't get to, because it looks like we've run out of time. I'd like to take this time to thank all of you for attending today, and apologies to many of you who tried to get in and the room was full. Thanks also to DCL for sponsoring Data Conversion Laboratory. You can learn more about them at their website, and for Ann Rockley for presenting. And as I mentioned earlier, the webinar was recorded, a link to which will be provided to all the registrants a few days from now. And additionally, you'll receive a few days from now a link to a companion document in which Ann will answer all the questions as I just mentioned. Please take time and complete the post-event evaluation survey and tell us how we did today. Completing the survey also provides you with an additional opportunity to ask us questions about the topic of today's webinar. Thanks again for attending, and we hope you have a wonderful day.